Thank you all for coming. It's terrific to have such a big turnout. So, probably like many of you, I have spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks being glued to the internet, looking at all of the intense storm events and reading some of the articles that are coming out about it. And we decided on this topic of weathering extremes back in June before we even knew that there would be a drought, before we saw the emergence of the big wildfires. Really was thinking kind of more broadly about the risk of these things. And but we decided that we because of this intense flooding that we'd had this spring, we would focus on this aspect of it and how the water board can help weather extremes. But we wanted to have another look at the other side of the story, at the bigger side of the story. The extreme weather events are associated with climate change, and we haven't at the water board really spent any time talking about climate mitigation. What do we do to slow the pace of climate change? And as former White House science advisor said, we will respond to climate change with some mix of mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. All that remains to be determined is the mix. So we can't just choose one. So adaptation, what we do here at the water board, getting ready for extreme weather events and trying to reduce their impacts, the adaptation will become more costly and difficult, and suffering will increase without serious mitigation efforts. On the other hand, since we're already experiencing these increased weather extremes, and it will increase suffering and social costs if we neglect adaptation. So we have to look at both aspects. We brought Maximilian Nieweiser here today to speak to us because we wanted to get up to date on BC and Canada climate policy and get a bigger understanding about what other people are doing on this whole other aspect of climate change. So I want to welcome Max, and I'll let him take it away on his talk.
Okay, well, thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for having me here. My name is Max Nieweiser. I'm the Program Director of the BC Climate Policy Program at the Pembina Institute, and I want to talk to you today on the transition to the clean energy economy, describe the global trends and the opportunities for British Columbia. A little bit about the Pembina Institute. Some of you might know some about us, but some might not. We are a national nonprofit think tank that advances clean energy solutions through research, education, consulting, and advocacy. So essentially, we are a nonprofit research group that is trying to move Canada towards a cleaner energy future. We have offices in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and this map is a little out of date. We also now have a small office in Ottawa doing some federal work. And so yeah, on the mitigation and adaptation side of things, we're much more on the mitigation side. Acknowledging both are important, but we focus on the mitigation side. Just a little bit about myself quickly. I have been with the Institute for about 3 years. I moved there after finishing my graduate research in global energy systems and energy economics. So I very much approach this issue from an academic side. That's changing somewhat and slowly, or actually rather quickly. This photo was taken last week, probably the last week of last hiking trip my girlfriend and I will do for a while. She is 5 months pregnant, so it's moving more into actually how do we make BC also a good place to live for families angle. So it's a little bit about myself. And then moving into the presentation. So today, just a quick outline and overview of what I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about just the global energy demand and how that's driving the climate change challenge. And I'd like to talk about a little bit about the trends happening, the exciting trends happening towards a clean energy economy. And then switch over to BC and highlight some of the challenges and opportunities for BC as the world transitions towards this clean energy economy. Very quickly, you know this all, of course, but the greenhouse gas effect is a natural phenomenon where greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere, absorb radiation, and then reflect it back to Earth. And it's a natural phenomenon, it's a good thing. Without it, the climate on Earth would be something like 33 degrees colder, and life on Earth wouldn't be possible, essentially. So it's a good thing. The issue is that humans are adding a lot of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, mostly from burning fossil fuels in our energy system. And that's, of course, is adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and the climate is warming. So that's the very basic of it. So I mentioned this is driven by the energy system. So let's look at the global energy system. Here you can see the global energy system since the Industrial Revolution, and the two big takeaway messages here really are just the rapid growth in our energy system since about the end of World War II, which coincides with the consumer society, the rise of the middle class, and that's been a good thing for us. So the rapid rising about 10 times in the last 75 years or so, and just the complete domination of fossil fuels in the global energy system. So fossil fuel, so clean energy sources or fossil fuel-free energy sources account for around 15% of the energy system. So all the new renewables, including all hydro, nuclear, and biomass, are around 15% of the energy system. And the rest is around 85% fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas. So the global energy system really is a fossil fuel energy system. We don't realize this as much in BC because we have such a big hydro system, but at the global scale that really is true. And then of course, the trend is, the growth has been rapid, so what happens in the next 50 years? This is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. We went from around 260 to 280 parts per million of CO2 at the time of the Industrial Revolution. We're now at 400 parts per million. And as you know, the world has committed to keeping climate change to below 2 degrees Celsius. And the climate experts have assessed that 450 parts per million is the upper safe limit that we have to adhere to keep temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius. So we went from 260 to 280 to around 400, and we have to keep it to 400. So that's up to 450. So that's the challenge. That's approaching quickly. So how do we do that? How do we stay below 2 degrees Celsius? This is a bit of an ugly graph, I apologize, but just look at the green line there. To stay at around 2 degrees Celsius, what has to happen to the energy system is that emissions have to essentially peak by the end of this decade. They should be peaking now. They need to decrease by around 50% by the middle of the century, and they need to approach zero by 2100. So instead of rising emissions, we need to drop them quickly. And 50% for the global energy system doesn't mean that everybody has to reduce their emissions by 50%, because some of the rich countries like ourselves use a lot more fossil fuels than other ones. So the analysis shows that to achieve this, we need to reduce our emissions by around 75 to 85% in rich countries. So that's where some of the longer climate targets are informed by. So BC has a legislated climate target of a 50% reduction by 2050. California has a similar target. The European Union has a similar target. And these targets are really informed by this kind of analysis. So what has to happen to our energy system to achieve this? I mentioned, and you saw the graph, that 85% of our energy system is fossil fuel, which is the gray part of that pie, and 15% of our energy system is non-emitting energy sources. So we have to get the 85% section of the pie cut it in half essentially by 2050. Now the challenge is that our energy system isn't constant, it's growing rapidly, and that's a good thing. There's a lot of people in the world whose lives would be made a lot better if they had better access to energy sources. So our energy system is growing around the world, and that's a very good thing. The challenge becomes that the system that was dominating our energy system, fossil fuels, have to shrink rapidly in a system that's growing. So clean energy sources have to go from around 15% of providing our energy to around 80% of providing our energy by the middle of the century. So that's the size and scale of the challenge. And how do we achieve this? We must essentially start moving towards only investing in cleaner energy sources of energy. This graph here is a little bit daunting, but I like this graph, and I think it connects a lot of the work that you do around adaptation that we do around mitigation. So this graph, of course, it shows the impact of climate change around different systems, food system, water system, ecosystems, extreme weather events, and it shows that impacts, of course, are increasing with high temperature increases. And it's not a linear function, it's really an exponential function. So the higher it goes, the quicker the damages start to add up. So we're around 1 degree Celsius. Today, we've warmed the planet by around 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. And there's starting to be impacts on coral reefs, for example, on extreme weather events are starting to really be driven by climate change, as we can start to see at the moment. And of course, it's very relevant at the moment here in BC. And there's starting to be some small impacts on the food systems and the water systems. Now the world has agreed to keep temperature increases to around 2 degrees. And that's driven really, and it's informed by two main aspects, or two main arguments. The one is that afterwards the damages just become too expensive and too damaging. And the second one is that the chance of sort of irreversible climate feedback start to increase. It's kind of a thing where it accelerates upon itself. And that's why this 2 degrees limit is seen as the safe limit that we have to stay to. And I mentioned this is where I see our world, the work that you do and the work that we do really connecting, because the world has agreed to keep temperatures to around 2 degrees Celsius. So there's moving to 2 degrees Celsius, there is going to be changes, there is going to be damages. We're going to have to do some smart, good thinking on how to adapt to those changes to minimize the impacts. On the other hand, it's very important that we do all that we can to keep temperature increases from exceeding 2 degrees Celsius, because above that, the damages just become too big and adaptation becomes really challenging. So we can't, as a society as a whole, we can't adapt to crop failures, not to be pessimistic, but we can't adapt to multiple crop failures in multiple major food producing regions around the world at the same time. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. So that's why it's really important to work hard to keep the temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius and then smartly adapt to the changes that are going to be in the pipeline. So that's pretty daunting. The challenges are big in the energy system, the consequences are pretty severe, but I like to say that it's not hopeless, and I really do believe this. Humanity actually has a really good track record at addressing environmental crises. We don't believe that because we think everything's getting worse all the time, but I think that's not the case. So we have a good track record on things like acid emissions, acid rain. 30 years ago, and the entire forests were dying, and we didn't know what to do. So what did? We cleaned up the way we produce coal-fired electricity with filters, with cleaner sources of fuel, for example. Not an issue anymore. Smog creating emissions and urban air pollution was a huge issue in the 60s and 70s. People wouldn't let their kids run around because of asthma and stuff like that. What did? We did lots of things, but essentially we put catalytic converters onto vehicles, and today it's not an issue anymore. Ozone depleting emissions, another global issue, and global issues like climate change tend to be more difficult to adapt, to deal with, but we found some solutions. We banned the substances that caused this, and now the ozone layer is recovering, from what I understand. Lead emissions, the example goes on. So there's lots of good examples on how we've solved these issues before. So that's pretty optimistic. And then the other thing that I think is optimistic is that actually we already have a lot of the technical and policy solutions available to move us to this cleaner energy future that we need to move to. So we have a precedent of solving these issues, and we do have a lot of the tools already, which is a segue to the next part of my talk, which is looking ahead and what's happening in the world and how the world is embracing the clean energy economy. So when I first did my research, we were optimistic that we could solve this, but it was very much going to be policy-driven, and the energy source that we're going to have to adapt it were going to be more expensive. It was going to come with cost. That's no longer the case. Things are really changing. And this is a graph that shows the global capacity and energy production of solar electricity. So you can see that since around 2000, so it's a 2015 graph, it's not up-to-date data, it's always tough to get up-to-date data, but essentially the system has increased tenfold in just 7 years. So that's just incredibly rapid growth, and it's starting to be at a scale where it's actually making an impact on the global energy system. So it used to be, rapid growth, but the contribution was so minimal that it didn't matter. it's rapid growth, and the scale is starting to really have an impact. So it's really exciting. And that's really driven by the decreasing cost and the increasing cost competitive of solar energy. So solar energy has come down more rapidly in the last 10 years than even the most wildly optimistic assumptions. So when people are doing moonshot ideas on how quick cost could come down, they came down much, much faster. So that's really an exciting trend. And to the point that today we have non-subsidized solar farms competing in the open market against super cheap natural gas in Texas, creating the cheapest electricity that humans have ever created. So that's the scale of the change that's happening. It's really exciting. Another example, dropping costs of batteries, lithium-ion batteries that we need for battery electric vehicles, for example. They've come down from $1,000 kilowatt hour in 2010, so the first mass electric vehicles were announced, to around $200 in 2015, and what we're hearing now with some of the new vehicles like the Chevy Bolt, Tesla Model 3, those costs are coming down to $130, $150. So almost approaching 90% reduction in 7 or 8 years in costs. So if that continues, we're going to get to a point, and we're very close to that already, where it makes sense and it becomes cheaper than internal combustion engines. So those are some of the exciting trends that are happening, and I really do believe that we're at an inflection point. These technologies are becoming cost competitive, they're becoming economic drivers, and it's just going to attract more investment, more learning, cheaper costs, and that's going to accelerate. So that wasn't the case 5 years ago. I wouldn't have made this argument 5 years ago. Things have changed, and it's changed for the better. And that's just, I could give more technology options, but that's just one part. The other one is on the policy side. BC was one of the first jurisdictions the first jurisdiction in the world to introduce a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Economists love carbon prices because they're the most effective and efficient way to reduce emissions. So BC was an outlier and moved ahead. Today, a carbon price exists in 7 of the 10 largest economies around the world. So, and that's just on the policy side. Flexible regulation, similar trend is occurring. So, exciting stuff happening at the policy level, very exciting stuff happening at the technology level. So things are really changing. So that's the global aspect. So how does BC fit into all this? First, I wanted to talk about how does BC fit into these exciting changes happening to the global energy system. The world is moving to the clean energy economy. So first, I want to talk about the challenges, and that very much sort of mirrors the first part of my talk, which is around just our emission profile and the things that we have to do. So BC was a leader on acting on climate. In 2008, we introduced the Climate Action Plan, introduced first revenue-neutral carbon tax, for example, clean electricity regulation, a few other things. And they were good policy. They were leading policies that actually managed to stabilize emissions and slightly decrease emissions. We didn't do very much afterwards. We started developing our fossil fuel industry, a bit more population growth, etc., and emissions started to increase again. And then last year, BC announced its new climate leadership plan. It's essentially a Climate Action Plan 2.0, our next stage of climate action. And at Pembina, we did a lot of work around it, informing it, what we think should be in it to inform policy and good policy that we need to move forward. Unfortunately, the plan wasn't as stringent as we hoped for. This is some analysis that we did with some friends at Clean Energy Canada that shows the modeled the impact of our new policy. And you can see in the green line on top, that would have been the emissions if we had not taken this next step on the Climate Action Plan. So emissions would have increased from around 60 million tons today to around close to 80 million tons. So there's an upward trajectory in emissions. With the new Climate Action Plan, emissions are lower. So the policies introduced are effective. They are having an impact. They're reducing emissions from where they would have been otherwise. But they're not enough to start to reduce our emissions, and they're definitely not enough to help us get back to our targets, to get us on a trajectory to achieve our targets. So that's some of the challenges here. And some of that, it's always tough to make forecasts, especially about the future. But some of that is driven by assumptions that we just don't know how they're going to revolve around. One of the big one is the development of our fossil fuel industry and LNG in particular. We did the same amount of modeling. We modeled and included the same amount of LNG in the analysis as the provincial government did, which is essentially the same amount of LNG as the currently 3 approved projects in BC. So Pacific Northwest LNG, LNG Canada, and Woodfibre LNG. And what we found is that, as currently proposed, these 3 LNG projects would emit around 18 million tons of CO2 across the supply chain, just in BC. And to put that into context, our 2050 targets are 13 million tons. And these projects are really big, capital-intensive infrastructure investments. They're going to have a long operating life. They're going to have to operate much past the middle of the century to turn profit. So the 2050 lens really is a lens to look at these through. So what did we learn from this? There's just an inherent disconnect on trying to develop a significant, large, emission-intensive industry at a time when we've committed to moving away from this. So that's a challenge. At the same time, if we have less of this development proceeding, we'll be making more progress towards our climate targets, and we're not as off the path, as off the mark as we think we are right now. And then, of course, we had an election here that you might have heard about, a little bit of political drama in BC, and it's fun to be part of. I think this government seems to be more invested in acting on this issue, and we as a world-renowned climate scientist, I think first indications are positive on what they're going to do, but it's too early to tell. We're looking forward to working with the government, but also ready to hold them accountable if they're not implementing good policy. And then I don't want to talk too much about not what's going on in BC at the national level, but I think it's important to know what's happening in Canada, just because it is important. Canada used to have been seen as a bit of a laggard on acting on climate, and last year the federal government got together with all the premiers and they hammered out the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. And it's actually quite the ambitious climate change strategy. I think people don't realize how ambitious it is. We did a lot of work around the consultation process to inform what should be included in this process, in this plan, in this framework, and the plan actually mimics a lot of what we asked for. So it has elements of carbon pricing that we ask for, action on new and existing buildings. It doesn't do as much on transportation as we would have liked, but it does lots of good things on methane reduction from upstream oil and gas operations. It phases out coal electricity. There's just no case to be made for coal electricity. We're trying to act on this issue. And on electricity and renewables, there are a few things that we would have liked to see, but overall, it's a pretty ambitious climate strategy that Canadians should be proud of. So that's some of the challenges, which is essentially that, like the rest of the world, our emissions are still too high. We're not really achieving the reductions that we need to achieve. How about some of the opportunities? So at Pembina, we do a lot of thinking around not just how do we get to implement good policy and that helps us transition to a clean energy system for environmental matters, but also what are the opportunities to help have a strong economy in this system that we want to move towards. So we published a report recently that's called The Vision for Clean Growth in BC, where we identify 5 key sort of strategic actions and priorities for economic security and prosperity in this changing landscape that's happening around the world. And these are building a strong clean tech sector, position BC to be competitive in the changing global economy, making clean choices more affordable, standing up for healthy and safe communities, and growing sustainable resource sector jobs. So building a strong clean tech sector. So clean tech, you might ask yourself, what is clean tech? It's a good question. Clean tech is essentially any technology or service that helps to address an environmental challenge and in the meantime provides economic opportunities. So examples would be advanced software that manages energy demand. It would be advanced water filtration systems. It would be new forms of creating energy. So that's kind of the idea of clean tech. And it's a sizable industry, actually. Definitions on what it is exactly vary, so the calculations on the size of the sector are unclear, but estimates are around $3 trillion a year for this sector, so very significant. And BC actually already has a very significant clean tech sector, so that's often not known. But this is a graphic here from the BC Clean Tech CEO Alliance, and when we talked to them, they identify that there's around 10 to 15 clusters around the world, clean tech clusters around the world that are really driving this, and Vancouver and Burnaby are one of these clusters. And you can see that in the numbers here. So that's 3,000 employees working in BC in 2006. That's up to 13,000 employees today. And when we talk to these CEOs in the clean tech industry, they're saying a lot of the research has happened, a lot of the development has happened, they've attracted capital. Now they're really getting to the stage where they're selling their products, they're growing their markets, they're exporting their products. Something like 80% of the products are exported. They're really at a very exciting growth phase, and they're expecting to hire have 50,000 people employed by 2025, so very near future. These are very good, high-paying tech jobs. So super exciting. The 50,000 number, I mean, they're entrepreneurs and tech people, they're inherently optimistic, but it's very exciting. The second point is position BC to be competitive in the low carbon economy. And the idea here really is that we want to ensure that we provide the goods and services, or we focus on providing the goods and services that are going to be in demand in the future. And that's changing very rapidly. So this is a graph here that shows natural gas demand under different climate scenarios. It's a bit techy again, but if you focus at the green scenario here, that's a 450 parts per million scenario. So the scenario to keep the world temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius that we have committed to. And what we see here is that natural gas, or LNG, but it's a natural gas demand, is essentially flat going forward. So what does that mean for the LNG industry? That we put a lot of political capital, human capital, all the financial resources already into it as well, is that this scenario is not consistent with rapid growth in the LNG industry. And if we add to this capacity, there might be overcapacity, stranded assets. People are going to be competing for, countries are going to be competing for their market share, and prices are going to drop very, very low. That's sort of the reality that we face if we invest in this industry today. And LNG has and natural gas has a role to play in the future energy system. Coal demand just falls off a cliff essentially. So there's a case to be made, but I don't think it's the economic savior that it's been made out to be. And that can be seen in prices of LNG. This just shows LNG prices. They have dropped around 70% since recent highs, and that's due to global overcapacity, but also a realization that prices are not going to be as high in the future. This commodity is not going to be worth as much as it once was. And that's without moving strongly on climate yet. So that's the takeaway. So what should we do? Invest? We should invest in the goods and services that are going to be needed in the future. You saw the growth in solar electricity, for example. Who can lead on this is going to really benefit. Another example is BC's energy efficient buildings. This is a project that we did in our building stream at Pembina. We focus a lot on the building sector and how to get energy more efficient, buildings more efficient. And what we found is that that BC is actually quite the hub for energy efficient buildings. And today we support around 32,000 jobs in the industry of clean energy efficient buildings, and that's from construction jobs to providing the materials, the design services, etc. So it's a significant driver already. 32,000 jobs in BC, almost 300,000 jobs in Canada. Our third point is making clean choices more affordable, our third strategy. And you can talk about a lot of different things here. The three things that we identified is investing in energy efficiency. So, for example, I just gave energy efficient buildings. That's just one clear example. It's just energy efficiency. It causes less pollution. It creates more money to be spent in the local economy. You just saw the number of jobs created from energy efficient buildings. That's one aspect. Economic development. The big economic benefit really is from the energy savings that people have from not spending so much money on the utility bills being recycled in the local economy. And that's really the big economic driver there. So it's a total win-win solution. Investing in transportation options, and especially transit options, it just makes total sense. It's less polluting. It creates more time for work, for productive work, for family time, and there's so many other benefits. So those are some of the things to make clean choices more affordable. And the last one is a realization on needs to be done on policy, and that is to target support to vulnerable Canadians, especially low-income Canadians, rural Canadians. And the idea here is that as we move away from fossil fuels and transition our energy system, there's going to be costs, especially in the medium term, short to medium term, as fossil fuels still make up a big part of our energy system. And that cost, if those costs increase, which is sometimes the idea of these policies, it could disproportionately impact low-income Canadians, for example, that spend a disproportionate share of their income on energy services. So that's a real issue that we realize. There is very clear and easy policy design solutions to address this. So we've always approached this from, we need to act on this, but let's act on it to not penalize anybody and to ensure that everybody can contribute in the benefits of moving to a clean energy economy. The fourth one is standing up for safe and healthy communities. The idea here is that acting on clean growth will make our communities more resilient and healthier. And I think this is, again, where a lot of the work that you do and the work that we do come together. So the two things that we identify is having ambitious mitigation action to limit the impacts of climate change to achieve our targets, because otherwise the impacts to our communities are going to be too big. And that's just, we can't accept that. And then the second one is thoughtful adaptation for the impacts already away to ensure that the issues that are coming, we're going to manage them smartly. And then there's going to be so many other co-benefits that are really going to be driving this. So the example I always give is the Ontario coal phase-out. So the Ontario coal phase-out is the biggest climate mitigation action that we have taken in Canada. Some even make the argument in North America. So it's reduced carbon pollution by the greatest level. The Ontario coal phase-out was not a climate initiative. It was entirely a public health initiative. Ontario went from something like 55 smog days when they had coal-fired electricity to 0 smog days. And the public health benefits have been huge. The climate aspect is just a side benefit, essentially. And that's the idea behind this point. And the fifth point is that we need to grow sustainable resource sector jobs. I think there's a perception out there that climate and environmental initiatives is something that people do in cities where you can easily bike to work, etc. I think that misses an important point and an important opportunity. And I think BC is particularly well placed to provide a lot of the resources that we need to help us transition to a clean energy economy. And there's lots of examples, but just 4 of them here. The local forestry industry, value-added forestry industry is a huge job driver all across BC, as you know. Well-managed forests can act as a carbon sink. We can provide a lot of the low carbon building materials that we need to have to achieve energy-efficient buildings. We could use wood waste to create biofuels, for example. And so there's huge opportunities there. The right, you see some copper, but the idea here is that in BC and Canada in general, we have a lot of the materials that we need to create the clean energy system. So that's another driver, and people from all across BC can help in this transition. Agriculture, the world is growing in population, the middle class is growing, demand for agricultural products is increasing. It's a huge opportunity. There's lots of opportunities to make these practices more sustainable and compete in a growing sector. And then the last one here, it's a photo of Ashley Creek, close to Squamish. The idea here is that rural BC can provide a lot of the clean energy services that we need to provide to make this transition realistic. And the idea here is, behind these 5 points, is that there's lots of opportunity that we really don't have to change the way we live. That we can provide a lot of the energy services that we need and don't have to change our lives. At the same time that all parts of BC can really benefit. And I think the Okanagan here is a really interesting position because you guys are at the nexus of a lot of these different aspects. You have the tech sector, you have the urban opportunities, you have the rural opportunities. So that's really exciting. Let's check my time here. Right, we're out of time. So, and lastly, so in concluding thoughts, very quickly, that the challenges are big for the globe as a whole, but we do appear to be at an inflection point and on acting on climate and energy. So it's very exciting. BC is positioned to benefit from this clean growth opportunity. So the opportunities are going to be huge. The people that lead on these changes coming are going to be rewarded tremendously. So we are well positioned to take advantage of this, but we must ensure that we don't miss this opportunity. We really must focus on how do we support this energy transition and how do we future-proof our economy. And then the last point on what can you do? You do already lots of good work, of course, on this issue. And there's lots of things I could say. I think the one thing I'd like to leave you with is that this narrative that it's the energy versus the economy, it's no longer true, but it's a sticky narrative, and it's not going away very quickly, and it needs lots of different voices to help spread the message that clean growth is real. It is BC's future economic opportunity. And if you help spread that message, I think that will do a world of good already.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Sean Reimer, and I work for the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and now Rural Development. I'm posted in Penticton, and I manage the Okanagan Lake Regulation System, which is the series of dams and dikes that stretch from Kelowna Lake down through to Osoyoos Lake. Clearly, we've had a very challenging year this year, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the conditions that really led to the decision-making around flows, outflows of Okanagan Lake, and some of the challenges around trying to hit our annual target levels for lake elevations and outflows. And I think it fits very well into today's theme of extreme and weathering extremes. There's going to be lots of examples of how extreme the extent was, both the volumes that we saw of the flooding this year, but also some other factors about how different this event was compared to what we've seen in the past. Quick discussion about how our decisions are typically made. So what happens is a lot of snow data and other weather conditions are collected through the early part of the year. And the River Forecast Center is part of my ministry out of Victoria. So they collate all the information available to them at the time, and they produce an inflow forecast, and that inflow forecast is into Okanagan Lake. I mean, that's the big driver of all of the decisions and all of the hydrology that I work with in the valley. So there's about 20 snow monitoring stations. 4 of them are near real-time data feeds. And they use that again along with rainfall data, lake elevation data to provide monthly inflows. And these inflows are volumetric, meaning that they give me one big volume that would go from their January inflow estimate. Goes from January to the end of freshet at the end of July. In February, I'll get it from February. March, I'll get it from March to July, etc. And so that we use this stuff, these estimates and these forecasts in our decision making about how much water we should be letting out through Okanagan Lake Dam in Penticton to try to hit these annual targets that we've had in place since the 1960s and 70s. I've just got a couple of bullet points here about the fisheries pieces, and I've used the word that some of the constraints in terms of our outflows, Okanagan Lake, and they're in place to protect kokanee and to protect sockeye and the kokanee in Okanagan Lake, particularly the shore spawning kokanee. We don't want to drop the lake typically over the winter too much because of the kokanee that spawn on the shoreline, and if we drop the lake too much, we could be dewatering those eggs and those fish would die. At the same time, it's been determined that higher flows early on in the spring can wash away the sockeye salmon eggs that are between Okanagan Lake and Osoyoos Lake. The Canadian Okanagan sockeye run is still the strongest remaining sockeye run on the entire Columbia River system. And so this becomes a constraint that we don't want to have the flows go too much until those sockeye eggs hatch and then emerge from the gravels and are ready in terms of their life cycle to be washed down to a Soyuz lake in this case. But I want to be very clear about something, that those guidelines, those constraints in terms of those outflows and the lake, the dropping of Okanagan Lake, do not supersede the flood control aspect. And we definitely override those if flooding is expected. Some of the data I'm going to show you from now on is going to try and give you an indication of how much that flooding just wasn't expected this year. Our snowpack was relatively low, and we basically didn't see this coming. I mentioned our inflow forecasting. They're based on that snowpack, so that, again, just drawing the line between the two, the information that was given to me was such that my decisions would not ever have thought that I needed to release the kind of water some people are discussing with me that would have helped the situation that occurred this year, particularly on Okanagan Lake. These inflow forecasts use historic climate change. And so what, in essence, they do is they take a look at the current conditions, snow, weather, et cetera, and then they basically go back in time and try to match those conditions against existing patterns in our period of record. And the unfortunate thing this year is there was no pattern that matched this year. It was so extreme in so many ways. In the end, I actually did override some of those fisheries guidelines. As we went through the spring and as the rain kept falling, quite frankly, we kept raising the outflows, and we finally got to the point where we were going to have to go higher than the fishery constraints. By then, most of the sockeye had actually hatched and were ready, but not all of them. So that the fish will have been impacted, as well as certainly people around the lake and everyone impacted by the flooding. On the top left, I have basically it's a table of the snow basin indices. And again, the River Forecast Center takes all the snow data that they receive from those 20 stations around the Okanagan. And they do it for the entire province, but for the Okanagan Basin, this was the numbers that we saw this year in 2017. So for all of the snow sampling data that we got in January 1st, and so for 16 out of the 20 stations are manually sampled once a month, right around the beginning of the month. Again, that information is provided to the River Forecast Center, and then they, again, collate that data to produce these indices. So our indices, again, January 1st, February 1st, 79%, March 1st, 80% or 86%, right around normal for April, and it was only really after the tremendous, again, April, May rainfall events that we saw that the snow buildup continued, and we got to about 150% of our normal. And it's comparative in some ways. If I look at 2016, when of course there was no flooding or anything, our actual basin indices were much higher through the beginning of the spring. And most people remember it being a warmer spring where we actually had an early snowmelt as compared to this year. The graphs are of some of our automated stations, and Mission Creek in the top right is the primary one we use simply because Mission Creek is the largest tributary input into Okanagan Lake, and it's on, of course, the east side of the lake. On the west side of the lake, we use the automated station at Brenda Mines, and so it feeds into that Trepanier area. So when you look at these graphs, the darker blue line would be what we saw this year in terms of the snow up there, and that's a snow water equivalent, so it's giving you what the volume of water is up there rather than the depth of snow. So the smoothest black line is your normal conditions, and your green line would indicate what last year was. And then, of course, the gray area is the historic range. So if I look at a Brenda Mines in the bottom left, you'll see that for much of the early spring, in fact, not only was the snow water equivalent and the water up in the hills there quite low, it was flirting with some of our historic minimums. Similarly, Mission Creek, again, our highest contributor into Okanagan Lake, it wasn't until we started seeing March and April, the continued rainfall that we saw, that we really saw the buildup. But even then, if you look at it compared to last year, we didn't have the snow in the, particularly in the high elevations there that we saw this year. The ultimate sort of issue with the rain and the water that came into the valley, and particularly in May, and we'll see some of that later, had to do with sort of a combination of the rain falling on the snow and coming in with a much more intense way that we've ever seen before. And then precipitation this spring. So this table was provided to me by Environment Canada. I took out a few of the columns that just were about temperature, but this is discussing what we saw this year. And again, the takeaway from this table is the three main Environment Canada precipitation stations in the valley: Kelowna, Vernon, Penticton. In Kelowna, the March, April, May volume of rain that came in, and March, April, May is what Environment Canada just calls spring. So they was the fourth highest on record in Kelowna, second highest on record in the Vernon station, and highest on record for Penticton. And particularly for Vernon and Penticton, those records go back over 100 years, which, again, geological time really doesn't mean much, but it is for sort of our human period of record of such things, it's reasonably substantial. So how does that translate? So in my world, I deal with inflows, again, into Okanagan Lake. And that's usually discussed in millions of cubic meters. And I don't know how that works out too in swimming pools, but every 3.5 million cubic meters is worth about a centimeter on our lake, which is 140 kilometers long. So when I look at the intensity of the inflows that came into the lake during May particularly, and again, they were high for March, April, and May, but not substantially. In this graph, the light blue is indicating what was there this year, whereas the black columns are normal, a 30-year normal. So you can see that particularly in May was when the water really hit us. And it certainly we've had no history of this kind of inflow into Okanagan Lake in that intense period. So there was no previous record of 5 weeks of inflows over 100 million cubic meters each week. That works out to, I think, over that 5-week period of 169 centimeters of water on the lake coming in. And each week, our outflow is more or less maximized at about 11 to 12 centimeters that I can take the lake down in that same time. So over each week, I can get about 11 centimeters. So our infrastructure, again, is limited. It's been built for a reasonably semi-arid climate. And so we do rely on our inflows, and we rely on a certain type of measured way that the water enters the system, the water comes into Okanagan Lake, that allows us to get it out. It's a big ship to steer, and really what we need to be able to do is make the decisions early on so that we can see the results later. And as I say, what's the problem with this year is that the early conditions when those decisions would have been much more helpful did not lend themselves to that type of decision. Again, a couple more graphics about, say, the intensity that we saw with May. Our average May inflow is 230 million cubic meters, and this one was 530 million cubic meters this year, which is actually about the annual inflow that we get usually into Okanagan Lake on an annual day. The bottom graph here is going back about 45 years, shows that what we got as inflows during May, and again, it's showing that this year has been the highest on record by at least 75 million cubic meters. Again, that works out to roughly 20 centimeters on the lake, even in just that month. The next highest would be 1997, which many of you will remember. Again, was another flooding year where we went substantially over our full pool annual target. The difference between that year particularly and this year was that was the result of a really high snowpack that we started building up well before Christmas, and it was sort of, we saw it coming. That one was easy to see. Do get a lot of questions about why don't we lower the lake every year, and discussions around our balancing act. We've had our annual targets in place since like the 1960s and 1970s, and generally they've done a very good job with this balancing. They've taken a lot of things into account. I mentioned the drought, I mentioned the flood control, the fisheries, even recreation. There's going to be some questions going forward, again, in the face of weather extremes. Climate change is suggesting that we're going to be seeing more and more extreme droughts, extreme flooding events, and it's going to be harder and harder to both see those coming, as certainly we've seen this year, and to react to those kinds of things. But as an example of the kind of balance we're going to do, I'm going to talk about the cost of these droughts that could potentially see us. There's a very large diversion on the Okanagan River, and again, that's what's being fed by Okanagan Lake outflows. And there's a large flume and piping system that the town of Oliver runs, and it's feeding approximately 3,600 acres of vineyards and orchards. And an extreme drought, particularly a multi-year one, could devastate that. And I mean, on an annual basis, the town of Oliver provided me with the fact that that's worth about $130 million direct sort of net profits to those. Again, doesn't take into account all of the secondary industries, doesn't take into account people who aren't using that flume system to take away water. So it would devastate that. An extreme drought would devastate the fisheries, could devastate some of the other related ecosystems in some of the oxbows and meanders around there as well. So it's something I have to keep in the back of my mind. And lowering the lake every year would definitely not position us well in any way to what might develop into a drought. Again, this year, early on, with those 79% snow basin indices in January and February, we were talking about drought. And in fact, we've seen it, but come in late in the year, but it certainly doesn't take away from the fact of the spring rains and everything that happened in terms of that extreme event. The top graph here, it shows, again, those historic inflows, volume inflows on an annual basis going back to 1920, something like that, 1921. And this is where I'm going to talk about extremes for a second. And when you think about, a lot of the times the drought planning people, they look back at the 1929, 1930, 1931 years, the Dust Bowl years, entirety of Western North America. The inflows we had into Okanagan Lake in the first week of May, second week of May, third week of May this year were higher than each of those years. So that means that in 1929, 1931, we had less than 30 centimeters, a foot of water came into Okanagan Lake. And it's the kind of thing we have to guard against, so that a foot of water in Okanagan Lake can make a tremendous difference the following year if drought conditions such as this start to arise. In those years, the outflows from Okanagan Lake, and we were regulated then, but not to the degree we are now, but our outflows at that time got into the 3 to 5 cubic meters per second coming out of Okanagan Lake Dam. What that indicates to me is there was many places in what was the unchanneled river at that time, there would have been no flow. By the time it would have gotten down to that Oliver area, there would have been, for various periods of time during those summers particularly, there would not have been any flow. There would not have been any ability to feed those 3,600 acres of crops. And it's very likely that if conditions were the same today, that those industries would be devastated. Quickly talk about my models, since I have 1 minute. Our models aren't great. When you look at, they're looking primarily at precipitation data that we can't really see that well out past about a week, according to the meteorologists. And they are looking at trends. They're not great. And our historical models have only, inflow models have only provided me with a monthly number. Again, that doesn't give you a lot of time to adjust during that. We have brought into being a second model to estimate our inflows. It just came online this year, and it certainly provides us with a more weekly things like this. But it also, again, it was not a good year to bring it online in terms of calibration and the like. We use a fish water management tool. It's different. It uses the inflow forecasting to give us an estimation of where the lake is going to get to. But if the inflow forecast is wrong, then it's not going to provide us with good information. Garbage in, garbage out. This year, our inflow forecasting was way off. There's no doubt about it. Didn't take into account, and it doesn't take into account ever those extreme events or the kind of intense precipitation that we saw. And that's what helped. Real-time monitoring stations. We are making improvements going forward. Every year we'll probably put in a new, more real-time snow monitoring station. One went in 2 weeks ago in Upper Trail Creek. Some improvements are being made. Again, we're trying to improve our modeling, but it's a slow process, and I could never say with confidence that we'll ever get to something that can take into account every extreme event. And just one more note here, my final slide. With any of these events, we review our actions. We review the flood situation. We do. There's actually a consultant that's been hired that is going to be reviewing lake operations here for Nicola Lake and for some of the other kind of flood response activities by my ministry. That's being handled out of Victoria.
Yes, I'm Corinne Jackson. I'm the Communications Director for the Water Board. And every year we have our Make Water Work campaign. Make Water Work is a valley-wide water conservation initiative of the Okanagan Waterwise program, and it's delivered in partnership with local governments and utilities throughout the valley. And this year with Make Water Work, it was interesting. The last couple years we've actually started our campaign early, asking residents to think about being water-wise on their landscape. And so normally we used to start at the end of May, early June. Last couple years we've started earlier, like early May. Well, this year we ended up delaying because on the very same day, some of you are laughing because you were invited and were going to be there. We're making treks from Osoyoos and Armstrong, and anyway, for the launch of Make Water Work in May. And on that very day, I had to send out a note saying, we need to postpone this because we're about to have this announcement about historic flooding in the Okanagan. And how do you message water conservation when there's flooding? Well, we postponed it a month, and we still had Penticton's Mayor Andrew Jacobite come up saying that he'd been hearing the song, what was it, by Alanis Morissette? Ironic. Because we were still dealing with flooding in June, right? So it was an interesting year trying to message water conservation while dealing with flooding. And yet we knew about the potential for a hot, dry summer, which was forecasted and which is now here. I remember I was on the radio with CBC talking about, and being asked the question, what are we doing talking about water conservation when there's flooding? And I had to point out, there's already fires that have started. So yes, we've got the two things occurring at the same time. And we had lakes that some people thought that we should be draining by turning on the taps. And this required us to educate on why this was not only a bad idea, but also it wouldn't work. And I know in speaking to many of you, mayors included, you've had the same conversations with your residents. So I wanted to acknowledge everyone's efforts in the Valley, mayors and my Make Water Work Committee partners, Zoe with RDOS, Rainey and Jen and RDNO, and folks from up and down the Valley. And ensuring that we did promote water conservation this summer, especially given where we're at right now in level 3 drought. And still, the fish are coming, we have crops that we need to water, and we've got firefighting that is going to have to happen for some time yet. So as part of the Make Water Work campaign, we do award Make Water Work Champion Community. So with Make Water Work, we invite people to go to the website, learn how to save water, and at the same time, take the pledge to act to conserve. And we award the community that collects the most pledges to as our Make Water Work champion. Well, when we had our launch in June, we had mayors who had already won the title in their community, stating their intention of taking that title back, and others saying that they were going to retain the title. And the numbers are in, and happy to announce that our winner this year is the City of Armstrong.
I was humbled by the phone call from Corinne a couple days ago, but in 2015, when I got the phone call that Armstrong had won, I was shocked. Last year, I got smoked. One thing, when you're on top, you can only go one way, and that's down. So last year, I got beat out. So in the challenge this spring, Mayor Ackball-Munn from Vernon harassed me just a little bit. So I really had to go out and work at it. I had those little wee cards that are given out. I gave them out around town. I challenged my council to get as many pledges as they could. I went to the local people that sell plants around Armstrong, gave them the cards, and said, please hand these out, make the people do the challenge. And as it worked out, I'm back up at the front. And it's going to be hard to hold it on to being a perennial winner, but I'm going to really try again next year. The media played a big part in it. I announced it at our city council meeting right after the challenge, and I got zero coverage in the paper. I announced it 2 weeks later at the next council meeting about the pledge, got zero coverage. So I had to personally go to the local reporter in the Armstrong newspaper and say, I really need this in your paper. And I finally got it for free. But all those little initiatives really help. As Korean said, when we held the challenge in the spring, the flooding was on Okanagan Lake, which everybody's aware of, and Doug Finlater's group had a forest fire here in West Kelowna this same day. It was unbelievable how it was changing day by day. And so with that, thanks again. Challenge all you second-class mayors to a challenge next year, and it should be fun.
This year was such incredibly bad weather. This is, of course, that little stretch of highway along Peachland where the highway was almost entered the lake. It was incredibly dramatic all up and down the valley, the kind of flooding that we had right at the valley bottom. It was odd because, as Sean showed, we had this dry, cold winter, and then it gave way to this incredibly unprecedented rainfall. The Regional District of Central Okanagan alone forwarded $20 million in flood response costs to Emergency Management BC, and there was millions more that came from the South Okanagan and from the North Okanagan. So the costs to the taxpayers were just incredible, just for the sandbagging and the equipment and the staff, the people who are working at the regional districts and were all working overtime at the emergency operations centers. It was just a huge effort. That all those millions doesn't include the insured and uninsured costs to people whose homes and properties were damaged, or to businesses whose businesses were damaged, and disaster financial assistance claims that will be put forward in the future. But then we turned this sharp corner, and all of a sudden we ended up with this record-breaking hot and dry summer. Kelowna had the Kelowna Weather Station. When I say Kelowna, I mean the Environment Canada station, had the hottest summer on record, and it had the driest summer on record in 100 years. This is for what you would call the settler record. I'm sure that there's a much longer history of records going back with the Okanagan Nation Alliance, but this is as long as Environment Canada has been keeping records. Penticton went from having the record highest spring rainfall to having the record lowest summer rainfall, all within 1 year. And then there were these fires. This is the Philpott Road fire in Kelowna that happened just 2 or 3 weeks ago that, went off like a bomb and filled the air with smoke. I'm getting so kind of used to the smoke in the air. It's kind of creepy. I was putting together these slides for the presentation, and there was one slide that had just this bright blue sky in it, and I thought to myself, that looks abnormal. So it wasn't supposed to be a bad fire year, according to this Atlantic article that I read yesterday. Because of all the rainfall this spring, it was not predicted to have much fires, but the heat in the atmosphere and the drying really triggered the firestorm season all over the West. There were other impacts having to do with the flood, though, that I wanted to touch on. This is a picture I got from Zoe at RDOS about erosion in a vineyard. When we went to a flood meeting in Oliver a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about the flood response and the general difficulties that they had with the floodwater. The people in the south end of Oliver were very concerned because the fire that had burned on Mount Cobo had removed a lot of the vegetation, and what they were seeing was this incredibly rapid runoff. So they had the heavy rains and then the rapid runoff from the burnt off areas and the tremendous amounts of erosion, very powerful stream flows. And everyone was concerned, of course, about the water, but also because of their recent history there about debris flows and landslides and that luckily nothing dramatic happened with that, but it's certainly a concern that comes with high flows of water. Another thing that happened, this is in the north end of Okanagan Lake, was when the floodwaters came up, there was a lot of flooded septic systems, and also erosion down the streams brought nutrients, both naturally occurring nutrients in the natural sediments and also any nutrients off the runoff from the roads and the landscape. And then we got this really warm weather, and it triggered a blue-green algae bloom. This is also something that people have seen in the Great Lakes this year, is the warmer temperatures triggering these blue-green algae blooms, which a lot of us drink out of Okanagan Lake and the different lakes in the valley. And so this is an aspect of climate that we're going to have to learn to work with and to adapt around and to try and reduce those kind of blooms as we can. Sean showed this graph of the variation in inflows into the Okanagan Lake. It goes back to 1920, and this is 1920 to 2016. 2017 will be among the fourth highest, is what Sean told me, even if we don't get any more rain for the rest of the season, which let's all pray that we get some rain. But it shows the intense natural variability of our precipitation in the valley. This has been going on for a very long time. But the climate models are showing us that we're to expect more and more variability. And that variability can happen between years, like you see here on this slide, but it can also happen within years. So this year we had this crazy switch from dry to wet to dry. But remember, it was just back in 2015 when we had the Snowmageddon, the incredible snowfall in Kelowna in January that was followed by this level 4 drought across southern BC. So within-year variability is something that we're going to have to manage and adapt to. Another thing, as my training was in population biology, I always like to talk about population. This is global population projections. The sort of normal forecasts, which are the orange line, are that we're going to be moving from a bit over 7 billion right now up to 9 billion by 2050, which is a lot of people in the world, and a lot of the people who are living in other parts of the world are going to, let's say that their environment is degrading much more rapidly than ours is. We're seeing a lot of migration globally. We're also seeing just a lot of normal population movement. People are being born here in Canada. More people are being born in Kelowna. There's a lot more, the demographic is shifting throughout the Okanagan. We're not just a retirement community anymore, so there's naturally population increase, and then more people are moving here. Just as an aside, I was looking at some of the old stuff from the Okanagan Basin study. In 1971, the Okanagan Valley had a population of 115,000, and the people who were working on the Okanagan Basin study projected that under business as usual scenario that we'd be at 391,000 population by the year 2020. Then I went and looked at the BC Stats projections. So they project that 3 years from now, we'll have a population of 385,500. So they were only off by 5,000 people over that span from 1971 to 2017, which is pretty amazing. But I think that we will see the population of the valley continue to increase. I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that that's just how the world is going. The Okanagan is a beautiful place to live. It's a safe place to live. It's a clean place to live, and there are a lot of opportunities here. So I think more people will be moving here, and we need to be ready. We need to plan for them. One of the things about having more people in the Okanagan is that when you have extreme weather events, when you have these natural disasters, if you will, then there are more people in harm's way. And so we need to be very careful with how we're designing our communities and how we're planning our communities so that we're reducing possible risks and harm to that greater number of people. I can't, there's one more aspect of global change that I want to talk about having to do with population is the potential invasion of zebra and quagga mussels into the valley. They're not here. Closest they are to here is in Montana, just on the other side of the continental divide. They're a symptom of global change that hopefully we won't have to adapt to. That is our goal. But if they come here, their growth in the Okanagan will also be exacerbated by climate warming because they respond to warm water temperatures. Right now, Okanagan Lake is warmer than the Mediterranean Ocean. Very beautiful warm water for swimming in, but also if you're a little zebra mussel, you can reproduce like crazy. So not only do we have good water chemistry for mussels, where there's lots of calcium so that they can grow their shells, but we also have nice warm water in the summer so that they can have lots of offspring. So this is something to be mindful about with the kind of changes that we're experiencing. So the question is, how do we adapt and plan for a resilient future? The things that we're doing for adaptation, I'm really explicitly framing them as adaptation today, but they have so much value for many purposes. They are practical things to do. They're best practices, and they make our communities stronger, healthier, and more sustainable. And they would be doing that even if we weren't faced with these problems with extreme weather events. However, I want to say that there are some things that we can't adapt to. This is a picture of a freeway in Houston last week. They had over 4 feet of rain over the course of a weekend. It was so heavy that it depressed the Earth's crust by 2 centimeters. And I don't want to dwell too much on these, and there's lots of horrifying things that you can spend a lot of time looking at on the internet, but what I want to emphasize is that there are things that we can do that will make our communities better and stronger, and we need to be focusing on what we can and should do. I had a sort of an embarrassing radio interview on Tuesday morning with Phil Johnson, and you know how enthusiastic he is about everything, and he wanted to talk about Houston, and he wanted to talk about the fires, and he wanted to talk about what the Okanagan Basin Water Board would do. And I found myself saying, well, people should be cleaning out their rain gutters. And I thought, he's talking about 4 feet of rain, and I'm talking about cleaning out rain gutters. But I think what I think about that in a bigger, more metaphorical sense is that, yeah, you need to start with doing the obvious things. You know, for the individual, it's cleaning out your rain gutters. For the municipalities, it's getting the drought plans in place, it's getting the flood mapping in place, it's upgrading the infrastructure as you need to do. And so that's what we're able to do. That's what is within the appropriate level for local government and Okanagan communities. And that is, I really want to emphasize that's what the Okanagan Basin Water Board is here to do. We are a vehicle that was designed for the communities to work together and address water issues in the Okanagan Valley. We're here to help all the communities. So just briefly, this is the Okanagan Basin Water Board as of 2017. We have our chair, Tracy Gray, and our vice chair, Juliette Cunningham. She's already introduced the board earlier. The water board, our jurisdiction, is that red line around the Okanagan Valley. It doesn't include all the parts of the North Okanagan, and it doesn't include the Similkameen, but it is the geographic boundary of the Okanagan watershed. You've already also been introduced to the staff, all of whom are here. There was one intern, Allison Thorpe, who's standing in the back, who was not introduced this morning, but I'll get to her in a minute. We also have, as part of the Okanagan Basin Water Board, is the Okanagan Water Stewardship Council. And back when the Water Board was formed in 1970, written into our legislation was to have this external technical advisory committee. At the time it was called the liaison committee, and it had people from different stakeholder groups and different levels of government who were all interested in water, who were there to support and advise the board. And the Okanagan Water Stewardship Council, after having been disbanded, the liaison committee got disbanded in the 1970s. It was reformed in 2006 and has been an incredible volunteer group to assist the water board with coming up with good solutions that work across all these different sectors and interests within the Okanagan Valley. The water board, if you look at our legislation, it's like people get very they have these ideas about what watershed agencies are supposed to be like, or what water groups are supposed to be like, and all the different things that they're supposed to be working on. And if you look at our legislation, the way that we're structured, we are structured as a tool for financial partnerships. We are a way to pool valley-wide funding to undertake activities specifically about water. We have the ability to receive grants from senior government. So this last year we got $268,000 in grants, which supplements our base funding, which comes from property taxes. We also are able to provide grants to local partners, and I'll go into that more in a minute. And we act to assist local governments to get external funding. So we actively help nonprofit groups and particularly municipalities and regional districts go after grant funding. And just basically our mandate is to bring more resources into the valley. We also create a platform for any kind of joint initiatives where people who are like-minded want to come together and work on projects and programs together. Over the last 47 years, we've had 3 different main programs. And we have resources. They are finite, but we have a base level of resources that we work with. Our primary revenue are levies that come through the regional districts. We've had the same requisition for about 5 years running now, so no growth in our requisition. We have had a growth in the grants that we've received from senior government, and just for the sake of accounting balance, I'm listing here that our interest that we earned went down, but I think that's really just a function of the low interest rates this year. Our expenses are somewhat more than our revenues because for 2 different reasons. One is that we have a reserve that we're required to have for the sewage infrastructure grants, but we're allowed to draw it down. So we intentionally work on not allowing our reserve to grow too big. And then the other thing is that we have funding from grants that get paid in arrears. So when we do water management projects, a lot of times our budget for spending on the water management projects are bigger than the income that you see in that particular year. And our aquatic weed control spending went down slightly last year, but I think next year you'll see it go up again, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's part of our 20-year equipment replacement plan. Sewage infrastructure grants, I'm just going to talk briefly about this. This is our oldest running program in the Okanagan. When I was talking earlier about the blue-green algae blooms and the problems with the flooding and the septic along the lake, the goal of this program, it was established because there was really an increasing problem with sewage pollution into the lakes, which is our primary drinking water source. And this program was established in order to upgrade our sewage treatment systems. We have some of the best sewage wastewater treatment systems in North America, and now we do. We didn't at that time. And the other is to get people off of septic and onto community sewer wherever possible. And this is a very slow, steady process where local governments, they identify a need, they apply to the senior government, and the water board provides matching grants. So it's a very important, kind of a sleeper program, but it has made an incredible difference in terms of the water pollution in the lakes and rivers. Eurasian water milfoil is our second oldest program. I like to use this picture of the girl in the bikini because just to show you how long ago it's been running. The invasion started in the early 1970s, and the provincial government was on full court press for a number of years trying to eradicate it. At one point in the late 1970s, they spent $2 million, not even adjusted for inflation. Those are in 1970s dollars, on trying to stop the spread of Eurasian water milfoil, and of course they didn't succeed. So we have a program just to manage it. We can't eradicate it. We have to manage it. We have one of our milfoil control operators here, Monique, is representing that part of our program. She didn't get introduced earlier because I think she came a little bit late. So we do have a little bit of milfoil control happening from the local beaver community, but that's pretty minimal. What we found this year is that the spring floods definitely increase milfoil growth. They do that in two ways. One is that, of course, they bring down the nutrients, as I talked about earlier. The other thing that they do is they change where the gravel beds are and sandbars. Anytime that like around Mission Creek where there's sandbars created, it's shallower and it's a new place for the milfoil to root where they can get up. They can only grow in, I think it's 18 feet of water. So the shallower the water gets, the easier it is to grow, and so they have an expanded range to grow in. The other thing is when you have these very sunny, hot summers, well, the milfoil likes that as well, and this is exactly what happened is we got a very, very vigorous growth of milfoil this year. The long-term planning for the program, we need to update our machines, our equipment. We are working on that right now, replacing and adding to our rototillers, which rototill in the winter and bring up the roots. They provide the best method of control, and in the places where we can't rototill and in places where we need to just do cleanup, where the rototill hasn't been completely effective, we do summer harvesting, which is like lawn cutting. So we have a plan in place to improve, update, and expand this program. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the water management programs, and these really have a tremendous amount to do with climate change and climate adaptation. I wanted to start by talking a bit about the invasive mussels. Our chair, Tracy Gray, talked about this right at the introduction. Mostly what people know about the mussel campaign is the Don't Move a Mussel and the billboards and the radio ads and all the public outreach that we do. But a lot of people don't know how intensely the board works on this issue. I would say that the board at our regular board meetings spends more time on invasive mussels than any other topic. And this is because it has the the potential to have so much impact on our infrastructure, and the quality of our beaches, the quality of our water, and our way of life. And there are things that we can do as an advocacy organization through letter writing, through policy influence, to move the government, to get them to do the right thing, to provide budget for us here in the West. Almost all of the invasive aquatic species dollars that are coming from Ottawa are going to deal with the Great Lakes. And this is a picture of some of our board members who were there in Ottawa in June, and they were able, through our MP Stephen Fewer, to meet with senior officials at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and talk to them about the issue and encourage them to provide more federal funding. We've also had a lot of support and action on this recently from our MP Mel Arnold and our MP Dan Elvis, who put out a press release this week. They have sent letters to Ottawa themselves. They held a public meeting in Vernon in August, and they're being very active advocates for this. I think it's terrific to see people working across party lines on this issue, because it affects everybody in Western Canada. Understanding water supply and demand is a huge part of climate adaptation, because if you're thinking about water scarcity, you really need to know where the water is being used and where it's coming from. There is a tremendous amount of work that's been done by a lot of great climate scientists in adding climate models, downscaling climate models for the Okanagan, so that we can have better predictions about both what's going to happen with the flows, the inflows that Sean was talking about, but also how that's going to affect the demand. When you have long, hot summers, you have much more irrigation demand. This picture here is of Allison, who's now standing in the back. We got her through a grant from Agriculture Canada. Previously she worked for the BC Ministry of Agriculture. She did the whole land use inventory of the valley in 2014 and 2015, and subsequently built up the whole GIS model around it. So now we know what's growing on all the different pieces of land, what kind of irrigation systems they have, and how much water that they're going to need. And this has been a tremendous asset to people who are working on things like irrigation plans and better understanding how much water is being used by each utility, and better understanding and being a bit predictive about what water needs are going to be in the future. This has also supported our work on environmental flow needs. Now, this is a project that we are working on very closely with both the Okanagan Nation Alliance Fisheries Department and the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations, to look at how much flows are needed in the streams to support different fish species and different fish populations. This is really important for climate adaptation and climate change, and there's several different reasons. One is we want to protect the health of our fisheries and our natural wild fish populations and the stream environments. But the other is that when the streams start running low, like they are this right now, even as we speak, we have some very low streams in the Okanagan. That is when the regulators have to come in and cut people off. So if you know in advance how much water is going to be needed in the streams, then people who are depending on have intakes on those streams, who have water licenses on those streams, they have a much better predictability about how they might need to manage their water supply, whether they're utilities or whether they are individuals with water licenses. So this environmental flow needs has a broad impact on all the different ways that we manage our water in the valley. Mission Creek Groundwater Surface Water Project is specifically targeted at Mission Creek as a pilot area. when we were looking at the environmental flow needs and starting that project and trying to understand it, and also there were some questions about the sustainability of the aquifers in the Kelowna area, this project was started in partnership with the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations to try to better understand what the inflows and the outflows into Mission Creek were to and from groundwater. So parts of Mission Creek lose groundwater, parts of Mission Creek are fed by groundwater. We also had the Black Mountain Irrigation District, Southeast Kelowna Irrigation District, the City of Kelowna, and Rutland Waterworks were also contributed to the funding of this project. So we're really working on trying to understand what the health of the aquifer is and how the aquifers are positioned feeding or drawing from the lake. And this will really have a big influence on what happens with groundwater licensing in the Kelowna area. And also what happens with the fish stocks, because the fish depend on the cold groundwater flows to stay healthy in the hot summer weather. Climate adaptation planning. We, this week, I think last night, Kelly hit the button on submitting a grant application to FCM in order to do a project that's specifically looking at providing resources to local governments for drought planning, flood planning, any kind of work that has to do with protecting the water supply and making the communities more resilient to climate change. We did a study funded by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, it's now called, looking at, well, we have all these different guides. There's a groundwater bylaws toolkit, there's a climate resilience toolkit that Columbia Basin Trust came out with. We produced a topsoil bylaws toolkit. There's a water conservation planning guide for municipalities. There's something like 50 different guides and toolkits that we found, but then we did a survey and we found that very few planners even know about them. And very few planners are using them. And part of that is an accessibility gap. They're all spread all over the web. No one can find them. And the other is that there's a lack of capacity among local government planning and engineering staff. And so this funding, which we have requested from FCM, is to provide expert advice and assistance, hire someone who can work directly with the communities, with the staff, find out what their specific needs are. What we heard from some communities is they wanted to have work on their flood construction level bylaws. Other communities want to work specifically on drought planning. Other communities want to have a closer look at their reservoirs. And so if all goes well, we will know in November. And it's such an important project that even if this grant doesn't come through, we're going to continue to pursue it, because we don't want to be just continuing to produce guides that aren't accessible for people. We really want people to incorporate these kind of plans and bylaws into their day-to-day work within local governments to make the communities more resilient. Flood mapping. So after the floods this spring, we found out that there was a grant opportunity from the National Disaster Mitigation Program, a federal program that specifically would fund flood mapping and flood risk assessments. So spent a good part of August working with the different regional districts, with Lisa at the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and with some external consultants to develop some applications to go to the feds to allow us to do flood mapping. The LIDAR is an incredibly important aspect of it. What this is, you can see this plane flying across the landscape. It's shooting a radar beam down, and as that beam bounces up again, it tells you to very precise detail what the height of land is. So as the lake level comes up, you can imagine this way you could be able to predict what parts of the community will be flooded at different lake levels. And we're doing this, the intention is to do this for the entire valley floor, and we're hoping, with the help of our friends at FLNRO, to expand that even up into the drainages where we're seeing additional flooding. So this is something that we're working on a lot of different ways. One is this grant application that went to the feds. The other is some direct lobbying or encouragement. Those elected officials who are going to UBCM, if you happen to be meeting with the Minister of Public Safety, this is something that is funded and supported by EMBC, so you can specifically say that you want flood mapping and that we need to have LiDAR flights for the valley. The more different sectors it comes from, the better. We had a meeting yesterday with the Water Stewardship Council, and there was someone from the forestry sector saying how much they would appreciate having it. Right now there is a data set available for the highest flood peak that's available for all GIS departments of all the municipalities for free from GOBC. Anyone who wants that can contact me. But that doesn't help as much with the sort of run up to the high water. So we need to know what the landscape looks like underneath the water in order to do the appropriate flood mapping. So that's going to be really important for climate adaptation in the future. Wetlands are another tool. Wetlands have an incredible amount of value for all kinds of things, from wildlife to cleaning the water. They take nutrients out of the water. But the reason why I put them in this place in the presentation is because they also are a tremendous tool for slowing down floodwaters, for taking the peaks off of the floods. When you take the peaks off of the floods, then you don't have, the water doesn't come up as high as fast, and so that it can more gradually leave the system. So it provides a buffer and a safety for communities that have flashy streams. And we've been working on the wetland strategy with many different partners for several years, including BC Wildlife Federation and the Okanagan Nation Alliance and the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Partnership and a number of different municipal partners. And now we're working to come up with a set of guides for municipalities who want to build constructed stormwater wetlands, because those are a very particular kind of wetlands that will particularly help with flood mitigation. Water conservation and quality improvement grants are a small grants program. Every year we do them. They're really on they address immediate community needs, but the ones that I've been most excited about recently are ones that look at specific where the pollution sources are, how pollution sources are entering the lake. That's why I have this picture of someone doing water testing. And another one that has been really great recently is this one with the BC Wildlife Federation, where you can get an app on your phone. People can, if they're up in the backcountry and they see someone mud bogging, they can take a picture and they can hit a button and it goes right to the RAP line, the Reporting All Poachers and Polluters line, and so it gets reported in that way. And it's a really handy way to sort of crowdsource monitoring of what's happening up in the backcountry, which is where the source of most of our water comes from. We have, of course, a major public outreach every year. We have the big Don't Move a Muscle program. We also have the Make Water Work, which we've just heard about, and the winning of the City of Armstrong for the Make Water Work champion. Alyssa and her twin sister Alyssa, that you see here in this picture, has been our terrific intern this summer. And it's just a program that we run that really tries to get it right to the people. And this is coming up to being one of my last slides. I guess I want to come back to that idea that we can work on what it is that was within our power to work on. Some things really have to be addressed at the level of the federal government. Some things have to be addressed at the level of the province. They're the ones who make the regulations, who manage the water in the lakes, who have the bigger funding. There are a lot of things that are directly within the power of local governments to do to protect communities from extreme weather, whether it's making plans, metering residences, helping people not wasting so much water. There's a beautiful picture here of someone planting a xeriscape garden. And in honor of my embarrassing conversation with Phil, yes, it's important to have people clean their rain gutters. So there's things that individuals can do, there's things that local governments can do, there's things that service clubs can do. We have a lot. We don't need to be helpless, but we need to be thinking about extreme weather in each of our, whatever is within our sphere of responsibility, and working on it, because I just think there's too much to risk if we don't.